Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Amma ba'd, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In this video today, we'll be looking at something that's very important part of our religion. We're going to be looking at how legislations and laws were formed, and what rules and legislations the people from the beginning of time follow until the time that we are in now. Now, the reason for discussing such a video or in making such a video is because there is a reason for we should really look into this, because the scholars have a big discussion on rules and laws and legislations. There is a big discussion in our belief, understanding the concepts of why certain people follow certain rules and why Muslims have certain rules, and are we allowed to accept differences in this issue. This is a very important part of our religion in understanding the concept of belief, understanding the rights of the prophets and how they sent had laws to be followed. The prophets were sent for certain reasons, and also regarding the commands of Allah to be obeyed. So what we mean here is that prophets were sent with revelation, and those revelation had something to do with guiding the people to what was right. So obviously this is something that's very important to understand and look at as Muslims. If you look at from the historic perspective and understand the origin of humankind and how they started, then we can see over time how they were running across a period of time, and what happened eventually to the time that we're in right now. So this will give us a good insight on understanding what is like, really give you a good picture of everything. Now, there is a big scholarly discussion on this issue regarding the hukum or the ruling on such a situation where somebody, what is the ruling on, for example, such a situation where the Quran is not followed, for example, or Sunnah is not followed, or laws are not followed that are in line with Islam. But this is not that discussion today, because that's a deeper discussion and there's a big scholarly discussion with a clear answer on that. We're here just to look at the historic perspective and mention that, and it may be, if it's needed, more discussion on the scholarly perspective of this, we can go into that another time, inshallah ta'ala. Now, to start off this, we're going to look at the first stage, which was how were the people in the beginning of time? Where is the proof that they were in such a way? Because we need to understand, when we look at such a situation, what was the origin of people? What were they upon in the beginning of time? We know that Adam alayhi salam was created and his offspring after him lived. But what were they upon? We have a statement from Ibn Abbas, and we have also an ayah from the Quran. We're going to first look at the statement of Ibn Abbas and what he says regarding the first stage. He says, كان بين آدم ونوح 10 قرون كلهم على شريعة من الحق. And in another narration it says كلهم على التوحيد. And in another narration it says كلهم على الإسلام. So we have three narrations that say either they were upon Islam, or which was really the oneness of Allah, establishing the ibadah of Allah wahdahu, yani worshipping Allah alone without any partners, yani la ilaha illallah, and following the commands of the Prophet at the time. كلهم على شريعة من الحق. They're upon the guided way, the pathway, the laws and revelations and rules and legislations. And there's another narration that says على التوحيد. Tawheed is, we've already mentioned this in other videos about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, establishing the لا معبود بحق إلا الله, that none deserves to be worshipped but Allah. And ibadah to other than Allah is shirk. But there's also bigger associating partners with Allah. That's the biggest crime in Islam. But anyway, generally speaking, it is that they were upon the truth. The truth that was the rules and legislations to follow. Now the ayah in Surah Baqarah says, كان الناس أمة واحدة. Allah says that people were one nation. فبعث الله نبيين. Allah then sent messengers or prophets, مبشرين ومنذرين, givers of good news and bearers of warning. وأنزل معهم الكتاب. Then He revealed with them a book, بالحق ليحكم بين الناس فيما اختلفوا فيه. So then Allah says after this, He says that they were revealed books, these prophets, that they should judge and rule amongst the people. يحكم بين الناس, to rule amongst the people with those laws and books. فيما اختلفوا فيه, in that which they differed. In that which they differed. Meaning regarding the truth. They were differing regarding the truth. So it's very clear here that the ayah says in the Quran that people were one people, they were on fitrah, upon the right path, worshipping Allah alone and obeying the commands of Allah. Then they differed. And then Allah sent them prophets to guide them back to the truth. And He revealed to them books that they may judge among the people and rule among the people with. So we understand here that when the people differed and went away from the laws of Allah, they went to different sins, or they associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like committing shirk. So all these various crimes that are considered haram and wrong, that broke the rules, Allah would send first direct implementation of laws, number one. He would send them laws to be implemented. How? By ruling amongst them a prophet who would rule amongst them. Direct implementation. So the people were sent a prophet who would judge them and rule amongst them. So that's number one. For example, such a nation had a prophet sent to them with a message to judge amongst them and rule the book amongst them, laws amongst them. Example of this is Dawood alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam. They were sent directly to their people with a law. Now Allah says in the Quran, فَفَهَّمْنَاهَا سُلَيْمَانَ وَكُلًّا آتَيْنَا حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا. That Allah says, we verily made Sulaiman understand, وَكُلًّا آتَيْنَا حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا. That we gave to all حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا. And there's another ayah that also mentions something along the lines of this. But the point is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave understanding to the people of Dawood alayhi salam and Sulaiman after, to judge and rule by the laws that Allah had sent. Then we had people that came after them who followed those laws, such as Dhul Qarnayn, such as Lut alayhi salam, and others that were not given rules and laws to rule amongst mankind, but were told to obey the laws that were already sent to messengers that who had laws and sent. So there is a clear direction from Allah that they should rule and judge by the laws that were sent at their time period. So we understand here that these laws were sent and revelations were sent from Allah directly. There was no change in the law, it was established. But over time, people changed the message. So here's, you can say, the next stage that came about. The changes to the messages. Now we know that Isa alayhi salam, when his book was revealed, the Injil, we know that the people, they changed the book. They even now it's accepted this fact that the Injil, the Bible today, is not the original form. It has many changes to it, and it's not in its purest form, pristine form. Thus, it is not in its original form, and things have been taken out from it, things have been added to it. So this happened after the time of the revelation, a time period after either the messages were lost, destroyed, or changed by their people. And this is the changes that took place in the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we know from a historic perspective that the Christians, Paul, for example, he changed pretty much the laws of Isa alayhi salam. This guy here, he came and he messed around with the laws of Isa alayhi salam. He started to make that which Isa alayhi salam made haram, he made halal. What he made halal, he made haram. And then afterwards, obviously, further to this, Constantine, the Roman ruler, he further established the changes and added things again from a Roman perspective, you could say, influencing the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that said time. So now you have effectively changes made on a higher level where it's established and legislated. So here you can say where the pure Isa alayhi salam's message of Tawheed has been now changed to shirk and associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now from here, obviously this rule and law was established amongst the people. It is legislated and used. So this corrupt, changed law has now been fully implemented amongst mankind. And this is where ظهر التغيير في تحكيم الله. Now here is where the appearance of the changes to the law of Allah have appeared and now fully implemented. So now obviously we have a situation now where this concept now of man-made laws, you could say, where did this come from? Because the concept of man-made laws, you can see that the view of, for example, the Roman ruler Constantine he was implementing a corrupt version of Christianity. But where did man-made laws come from? These laws that are completely disconnected from religious laws. Like, where has this all appeared from? Now in our time today, we can say the French were the first people to begin this taghyir of tahkim. They began this journey of law changes to the man-made law today. And you can say this was done and spread over the east and west. So the French were the first to publicize and establish it globally, on a global scale, from east to west. And before 200 years ago, it was Napoleon Bonaparte who had really, he started to develop laws that were based on no religion. Based on no religion, based on no values, just took concepts from here and there. And, he wanted this to compete with the laws of like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yani you could say at the time he was using concepts from different parts, like portions from the Injil, portions from Islamic law. Even it's mentioned in history that he even took concepts from the Muslims. But in overall, he based it upon humanistic and no religious value at all. So he tried to combine what would make sense at the time to him and his counterparts. And from here developed the concept of power to the people based on desires and humanistic values. Now once this started to appear, that the laws of France started to be implemented in their lands, further after this, the countries that were now following their suit in a sense of dominance over the globe in trying to establish their power, like the French, the British, the Spanish, Italians, for example, the Dutch and the Germans, etc. They all started to form what was in their view a law similar to that of the French. So they took kind of the constitution of the French and they said this is like the kind of the guide for us to do the same, because they all wanted to move in the same pathway, that okay, let's now develop our own laws and implement. So the same thing, same kind of concept took place within these nations. And now you have a full-on implementation globally of what you could say is the Spanish law, the British law, the Dutch law, the German law, and the French law, and the Italian law. Now these laws are being spread across because these countries now are competing with each other to get global dominance. And here you see that now obviously the laws of man-made laws, now the man-made laws are now spreading over the lands where these powers are now obviously legislating and ruling over. So they're legislating powers and they're ruling over this country. Thus, man-made laws spread far and wide across the lands that were obviously controlled by these nations. Now here obviously we have a question to ask ourselves. How did the Muslim lands now obviously become lands where man-made laws were spread far and wide amongst them? Because obviously we need to look at where was this kind of like concept, where was this concept coming from? Because obviously we have before, it wasn't like this. So we need to understand what happened, because obviously we have the Quran, it's complete. What was the moment when this all took place? Now obviously we have to understand that at the time of when the Muslims were ruling and they had Islamic law being implemented, the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you could say, the laws of God, the Quran was obviously implemented, Quran and Sunnah, and what the scholars understood from their collection of understanding the Quran and Sunnah, they implemented this. And we have schools of law in Islam. We have schools of law that are considered the four major schools of Islam that rule. Obviously they have slight differences, but those differences are not that big, they're quite acceptable, and they usually all their common values are accepted. That the main pillars of each kind of chapter of law, they usually are like in line with each other. They just differ on about a small percentage, and thus those small differences, those are they're not really like that major, and there shouldn't be like bickering and fighting over it. We should, they're light differences that can be accepted. So those schools of law obviously were implemented in the various lands that the Muslims were ruling over. But then there appeared the Tatars with the Al-Yasiq or Al-Yasa, and this was a combination of laws where the Tatars or the Mongols, you could say, ruled over the lands of Muslims. When they invaded the Muslim lands, they began to rule over their lands with what they considered to be a mixture of Quran, the Injil, which is the Injil and the Torah, and their own customs that they had themselves. So their own customs, as well as the Majus, the fire worshippers, they had their customs as well, took that as well. So they you could say compiled all the laws that they saw fit. This was an early appearance in the Muslim empire, you could say, when the Muslims had this challenge amongst them. And then obviously when this was in Mongolia, it spread when they invaded the Muslim lands, and it went from all the way from their land, Mongolia, where they originated from, all the way to Iraq. And then obviously these people became Muslim when they invaded the land of Muslim. Obviously it was prior to their coming of Islam. And obviously they implemented their kind of version of law, which they saw to be kind of correct. But they were Muslims, they were claiming to be saying they were Muslims, and they were ruling by this. So at the time, the Muslims didn't agree with this, and they fought them, and they took over the power over them and replaced it back with what was the correct rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the time. So the Muslims didn't accept it because they said this is not acceptable, it's not the law of God. So they took back control and took away this law and implemented the laws of Islam. So obviously now we have empires now after this that came nearer to this time that we're in today, the Ottomans specifically, and obviously we had the Ottomans that ruled over a vast majority of the land of the Muslims in our nearest time to us. And at this time, how were these laws now obviously removed? We have to understand this. They were removed recently until now, like till when the Ottomans were removed from power and they were kind of finished. Their rules have now obviously they're non-existent. So where did this happen from? Now obviously at the time when the Ottomans were ruling, people in specific small groups began to appear calling for reform in Egypt specifically and Arab lands, and obviously Turks that were ethnic Turks calling for nationalism and calling for establishment of their own like kind of pride, and they were calling to nationalism mostly, and people were like kind of protesting against the call of this Ottoman view of everyone's together. They didn't really like this idea. So obviously when these groups formed, to establish Western laws in the land of the Muslims, they began calling out, saying we want what is considered to be the modern development of law. So obviously in 1908 was the first stage in which the constitution was established based on what was considered man-made law, taken from the Western thinking, obviously those countries that had already spread their laws worldwide. As the abolition of the Ottoman Empire came about and it was being wiped out, they began to legislate and rule by the laws that were now taken on from the countries obviously that were inheriting these lands or kind of getting together to take the land for themselves. And thus the laws began implemented. So you had laws being implemented slowly by these powers. Then you had obviously the state of Egypt being formed, obviously when they began to develop their own nations. Egypt was the first country to develop laws in 1923. They made their own laws based on man-made laws, and this is the law that's commonly spread across the entire, wherever Muslim rule is, where his man-made laws rule in Muslim lands, is most commonly taken from the Egyptian law, which was the first country to develop their own man-made law constitution. Afterwards, obviously, India also, changed from Islamic rule to English law, because the Brits, obviously the UK ruled over India, and you could say the British Raj. And then they were given the governance passed over to the Hindus, obviously in power. Hindus took over after the Muslims, and now that law no longer existed where Muslim law is not to be found. Thus obviously, because obviously the British ruled over vast majority of the earth, the British rule became the most common source of man-made law across the whole globe. Now, obviously, now we've come to a stage where this is the stage we're living in, and how it got to the current stage we're in. It's a historic insight. Obviously, we're basically on historic facts that are there to be seen, and it's clear cut for everyone to know about this stuff. But it's important to know that obviously in the beginning, the first stage is that everyone was following the religion of Tawheed. Later on, people differed. Then differences came about. Allah sent prophets with messages. So obviously, this really is an important question for us to look at. What is the view of Muslims regarding laws and rules? Obviously we as Muslims are told in the Quran to follow the Quran and Sunnah. and we are told to follow it at all costs, and it's our duty to be Muslims who are upright and follow the Quran, because it's the guidance from Allah. Now, looking around you, obviously, we are told, and I'm mentioning this from a historical perspective, obviously what's taken place in history. But as we know, the Quran is the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, revealed from Allah, sent to the Messenger Muhammad, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was telling the companions to spread this message, and obviously they were ruling by the Quran. So it's a no-brainer for us to know as Muslims that the importance of making in our day-to-day lives the implementation of the Quran and Sunnah in our day-to-day lives in everything that we do. We have to think like that. So I'm just obviously mentioning this historic perspective, but also it's a good point for us to take on board that we are to try our best, utmost best, to follow the Quran and Sunnah in our day-to-day lives, and do our utmost best. Ittaqullah mastata'tum. We should try to fit Allah to the best of our ability. Inshallah, I hope this historic perspective helps in understanding the dynamics and the way of how laws were formed according to the Islamic perspective. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it beneficial, and inshallah ta'ala that if there's any further videos that we should be making, inshallah we'll be looking into some other topics historically as well. Inshallah, we hope that this was beneficial. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.